Father, I pray that as we're gathered here and as we wrestle with this very old psalm, probably the oldest in all of the book of Psalms, that we would also be able to reflect on who you are in your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You may be seated. I'll apologize right up front for those of you that are more comfortable in Korean. Due to a little bit of the complexity of the sermon and also just in terms of space, these slides, I just did not have an ability to find a way in my head where we could fit this all together. So if you have the handouts before you, please refer to those. The Korean text is, of course, on one side, but the outline is on the other in English, okay? And our outline has some blanks, and even if you're not as comfortable with English, I think you can write a few words down in English. The missing blanks are going to be written in gold lettering up above, where you can see those and fill those in. The title of today's message is Measuring Life. Measuring Life. I don't know about you, but there are certain kinds of things that are hard to measure. When I was growing up as a boy, I remember in our house, we'd go to this door frame. And right next to that door frame, my dad would take a book. And he would set it on top of my head as I was standing next to that door frame. And I would scoot out from underneath it, and he would mark how I had grown. I don't know if you have one of those things in your house, but that's a tradition that I actually carried on and passed with my son in one of the houses that we lived at. And we would mark how far he went. He even had this fancy little chart where we would mark it off, and it was actually a little picture of Ice Age, the movie, and so he could measure himself as he grew. Some things are easy to measure, but some things are really hard to measure, aren't they? Like life. Or if you say, I love you, how do you measure those things? These things are rather challenging. And when we reach certain hard times or difficult times in our lives, we find ourselves measuring those kinds of things that are very difficult. We're sort of weighing through and sorting and figuring out when there's no clear units of measure, when there's no clear demarcations that we can mark necessarily. And I believe that this psalm is one of the most practical and powerful and useful things that we can look at to know how to measure our life. Well, along this line, you probably have some questions. Because really measuring life is asking these kinds of questions. What's the meaning of life? And by the way, just as the announcement mentioned, the Yoon family is very grateful for all the outpouring of love. People have brought by food, stopped by to visit, ask how they can help. And it's been wonderful to see our body come together and show love. And while they're away, and as we're here working and wrestling with this message, it's interesting for me as a pastor to look at our church, both Korean and English, and seeing you all wrestling with this particular question. What is the meaning of life? This is the tunnel where we're all walking through together, trying to figure out and make sense of the things that have happened within our church, within our family recently. What's the meaning of life? And maybe you go on a little bit variation of that question. What do we live for? What should we live for? Why? What purpose are we living for? And then how do we make these kinds of decisions? How do we determine what's really important and what's truly not? In times of crisis, it always helps us to sort through things because we have to clear away what's not important and prioritize those things that are important. So in today's message, as we're talking about measuring life, these are the kinds of questions that we would wrestle with and many more. Well, because I just want to be very straightforward, and this is the main point, that first line, I'm sorry I lied because there's no yellow on this one, okay? But this is the main point. Seek God. Seek God. Because life only makes sense with His blessings. Seek God, because life only makes sense with His blessings. Well, we're going to dive into our passage, and there's an inscription at the top of Psalm 90, and if you read the passage, whether it's in Korean or English, it's in parentheses or offset to the reference. It says, "A prayer of Moses, the man of God." And it's a very powerful statement that it's saying it's the man of God, and not very many people were called the man of God. Only Moses, Elijah, and Elisha in the whole Old Testament were called the man of God. So he's in a very exclusive club. In fact, 2 of those 3 were with Jesus in the Transfiguration, right? But Psalm 90, as I mentioned as we prayed, that this is one of the oldest Psalms. In fact, it is pretty much agreed that this is the single oldest Psalm in the whole of the book of Psalms. It was one of the first ones ever written down and recorded and kept. And we also need to know one other thing about this, because if it's attached to Moses, one of the things that we can see is very likely Moses wrote this perhaps during the 40 years in the wilderness, and perhaps he either started it but likely completed it by the end of the 40 years of his life, when he was about to look at the promised land and he was not to be let in. And so this was the crisis in his life, because everything he had poured his life into was to get to the promised land, and he got all the way up to it, but he couldn't go in. And so now he's looking back over the course of his 120 years, and he's making a measure of it and saying, what was it all about? Why am I here? What was it all for? Was it worth it? And I don't know about you, but if you were raised up to be in Egypt, to be a prince and to rule over so many things, and you throw that away, and then you become a shepherd in the desert with the Midianites, and then God calls you out of that to suddenly lead all these people, but then it's not as glorious as you thought it was. Some estimates even put up to 1.5 million people wandering through the desert. And it was some of the hardest years of his life, but God made him for this purpose. So this psalm speaks about these kinds of things. How hard it was to lead people when they didn't want to follow. To bring people together when they all wanted to go in their own direction. 40 years of fighting. Well, if you look at our handout, by way of introduction, I've covered Psalm 90. But what I've done is I've covered 2 outlines, and I've separated them out for you because I think it just is visually, it helps that way. It's much clearer. So at the top one is really a simple outline. It's the simple overview of our passage today. And we're going to see these sprinkled with our Arabic numbers, like the number 1 at the top here, dwelling. Okay? And that will be repeated. But then underneath there'll be some letters and then some lowercase number 1 in Roman numerals. And that will help us through. But when we look at our passage, the first main point that we need to see is that this first topic, I believe, to kind of divide this up, is talking about our dwelling. It said, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or you ever had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. The word home is not exactly in our passage. But this word dwelling is pregnant with meaning, and there's different possible ways. There's some different definitions within the word that's used here. And dwelling is what's most commonly translated, and it's also one of the more flexible ones. But it can mean safety. It can mean shelter. It can mean all these different things. And it pictures this idea of some place that's cozy and safe. You know, I think Moses was looking for dwelling place. They were supposed to go to this promised land. But even with the promised land, Moses is saying what? You have been our dwelling place. Because he thought so much about the promised land, but he didn't want it to become too big in his mind. And our reality that we need to wrestle with today is this world is not our true home. Our real home is what? In you. In you. I said it at the memorial, and I know some of us were not there, but I will say this again. Andrew wrestled with finding home in this life. But you know what? In the end, he found his way home to his true home in heaven. And we need to be very sure, very clear in our mind to rearrange our priorities in life and our perspective to understand is that we have something much, much greater with God in heaven. All others merely point to you. In this passage it says, you've been our dwelling place, and it starts off with Lord, right? Adonai. And interestingly, verse 2 ends with God, Elohim. Lord speaks, another way you could translate the word is master. And then God is God or sovereign. And it paints this picture between these two things that the main first and last thing that we should be thinking about in this section is God. And what is it talking about in the middle? All life is under sovereign God's rule. He's in charge. He knows everything. He knows what He's doing. And when we get discouraged because of things that happened, we need to look around and be able to say, you know what? No, God is still in charge. We can be encouraged. So all life is under God's rule, His sovereign rule. And there's another thought that follows. Number 2. This is the main section for verses 3 through 6. And while we talked about dwelling, the second word I want to talk about is dust. And it's right here in our passage. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. And it goes on and talks about death. You return us to dust. Is what? You know, we can do all sorts of things at funerals to pretty up the body. And it's really interesting. I was having a conversation with a funeral parlor owner, and one of their jobs is, of course, to make the body presentable if it's going to be presented at a viewing or sometimes directly at the funeral. And one of the big factors is how fresh is the body, because they have a lot more work to do if it's been decomposed. But you know what's also very interesting? All the muscles that you exercise in your face, those are the muscles you build up. If I take one half of my body and I exercise this one and I leave this one here, this side will be huge, but this side will be weak. But you know what? The same thing happens with our facial muscles. The muscles we exercise, whether they're frowning or smiling, those are the muscles that will be there when we die. And so some of the funeral folks, they have a really hard time, and it's really complicated because there's only a handful of muscles that make sadness. I believe 2, 3, or 4 major muscles in your face. But a large number, double digits, I think it's upwards in the 20s, of numbers of muscles that form us when we smile. And there's no way that someone in the funeral parlor can massage your face and make you smile like a real smile. So if you've seen people that have passed away in a funeral and you go to their viewing and they've not been a happy person, they can put a smile on their face, but there's so much missing there. You know, our face says so much. And here he's saying what? You return man to dust, and you say, return, O children of man. And we can be prettied up for a little while, even if we have a smile. But we will all eventually become where we came from. This word dust is supposed to remind us all the way back to Genesis and the word Adam. Adamah means dirt or dust. And Adam is, of course, a play on the fact that that's where Adam came from. And so from the very beginning of mankind, we will return to become just like Adam was before he was dust. When God scooped that up and formed us, and when he returns us back. There's also about time here. You hold death and time, therefore our lives too. And it's fascinating because you've heard that phrase, 1,000 years is like a day to you, and a day is like 1,000 years to you. And it's a statement about relative time, but it's a little bit different here. 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday, when it's already passed. It's not even today. In fact, it even shortens that time period even more. It says, or as a watch in the night. A brief time of 3 hours. You know what, 1,000 years? What's 3 hours compared to 1,000 years? In essence, it's not very much at all, is it? Saying our life is so small, but our God is so big, right? And interestingly enough, the translation in the ESV, so you sweep them away as with a flood. The word flood is not actually in the Hebrew, but the word sweeping away, the first times of mention would have been in the book of Genesis in the story of Noah, when God brought all of this death. And then building on the water metaphor, he says what? They're like a dream. They're like grass that is renewed in the morning. In other words, there's grasses and they turn green because overnight they got some recovery from the heat, but then the heat of the day will beat them down and they'll turn brown by the end of the day. He's saying our life is even shorter than that. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. Verse 3 and 4 just tell us that we're so temporary. When we look and we attend a memorial or funeral, one of the things we come to grips with is our mortality, that we're temporary. Life is short. Life is so brief. Ecclesiastes says that our life is but a vapor. And it's very funny, that vapor, it's the same kind of imagery that we get with the Holy Spirit when God breathed into man the breath of life. And it's so fragile, so fleeting. We are so temporary. What is that like? Well, verse 5 and 6 goes on, you sweep them away as a flood, like a dream, like grass that's renewed. And what? Life withers away quickly like grass. Grass. The third section covers our disposition. So we talked about dwelling, dust, and this word's not directly in our passage. But it speaks about that God judges our sin. So only what He thinks matters. Only what He thinks of us matters. Our passage is pretty lengthy here, but we're going to break it down again into pairs of verses. For we are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. And we perish, why? Because we're unworthy. Why? Because of our sinfulness. And every day Moses got to see a whole bunch of sinners, including himself, slogging through the hardships of life in the desert, seeing their complaining, seeing their lack of strength, of faith. You might say, well, we're not in the desert, Pastor Eric. And you know what? I guess my life, I feel like overall it's pretty good. And I just ask this question, really? Really? I think for many of us it's very easy to say, yeah, I think there's more than a few things that I'd like to be better in my life. So we move on, and our passage tells us, "For all our days pass under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, over even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away." Our whole life is what? We run from you. We run from you. Some of us do it not as far. Others do a lot more. But isn't this one way to picture our relationship with God? A couple weeks ago in the English side, I preached a message on fatherhood. And it wasn't for the Korean congregation, but it was one parable out of three, a very famous one, the prodigal son. But that prodigal son sits third in a series of three parables called the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And you know, the father never really lost the son. It's that the son ran away. But in a manner of speaking, he did lose his son. And in our Christian lives, I don't know if we properly associate ourselves in the prodigal son to say, "I am the runaway, and I am lost." And every time I read that parable, I'm just convicted. I said, that's me. And in our lives, what's Moses saying about all these things? We run away from God. I must be honest. Sometimes pastors fight with their wives. I'm laughing because you need to know that, okay? And sometimes I'm not listening. I'm ignoring. And it's hard. And in some ways, even though I don't walk out the door, my heart or my ears have run away. In all our lives, so many things we do say, you know what, God, I just don't want that. Not so much. Heaven forbid I actually have to sacrifice. I don't want to do anything more for church. I don't want to go too crazy for you, God. And we hold back. It's all different forms of running away. Is this really true? Is this truly what's happening? And under our disposition, our attitude or perspective on God and His towards us, of what God thinks of us. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? This verse alone is in essence saying what? You know what? Nobody fully comprehends how much justice and wrath we're fighting against. You know, and by the way, you might feel like, oh man, God, wrath, scary. That's not good. But I do want to point out this. God is the only true and just judge. And you remember the time when David decided he was going to number the people of Israel? He wanted to take a census. And there was no reason to. There was no need to. It's not like there was a great famine. There wasn't going to be a great war. It was a time of peace and everything was at rest. And why did he do it? Only because of his own pride. So he could say, look at how many people I have in my kingdom. And the Lord saw it. And you might think, oh, that's not a big deal. He's just going to count. He'll spend some money and they'll come up with this number. But God was very displeased. And because of that, what did God do? He was going to kill David's firstborn. And you know, God gave him a choice. He said, I can have a plague come, I can have another nation take you over. What would you like? And you know what David said wisely? He said, none of the above. I'd rather fall into the hands of a merciful God. He also understood that if the plague came or if this nation overtook them, that the glory of God would be diminished. And he saw the depth of his sin in trying to make this census. And what did he do? He considered the wrath of God. That he did not respect that enough at the beginning. And so as a consequence in this psalm, Moses comes out and says, so teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. In other words, let me measure out how long my life is. Young folks, this is one of the most useful things that you could ever learn to do. Let's say you live a normal lifespan. According to our times, it's about 80 or 85 will be probably when you die. But you know what? You kind of have to clip off some of those end years because you're just not going to be that strong. In fact, who knows if you got a lot of marbles rolling around upstairs by that time. So maybe you'll chop off 15 years. It's not like you're going to be, building huge buildings and taking over the world. And you know what? The first 5, 10, 15, 20 years of your life, you're still just building up. Maybe even more like 25 or 30 or 35 if you're going to grad school, right? So in some senses, maybe your life doesn't even really begin, the bulk of it, the meat of it, until you're 35. So you go there and you're looking at 70 or 65, and then you go from 30, 35 years of productive life. Is that long? Now think about it. If you happen to be 15 years old, you've already spent about half that much time of your most productive years. It's already all half gone. That amount of time. And there are so many ways that we can look at counting our days. One guy I knew, he constantly looks at the decades of his life. And he measures out 10 years at a time. Now, it helps to have more than one decade under your belt. But when you start getting past the second decade into the third decade, you realize, whoa, there's really just not that many of these things. 3 or 4 of them? Time goes fast. Another way you can count the days? You can look back at when you were young, who were the oldest people that you knew? And then when they were young, how old were the oldest people that they knew? And you can go back hundreds of years in just a few leaps of generations, and you realize all of this time has been spent. You, as a young person, can talk to a grandparent who talked to grandparents' aged folks of theirs. And now you're back 1, even 2 centuries. It's not that hard to get 1, 2, 3 generations, and you're 200 years back. And our lives are so small. And what's he, in essence, is he saying? With all this time in the world, we waste so much of it. But what happens? We don't know you. That's our big problem in life. We don't know you. So help us to know you. If God's going to judge us, and if His thoughts are the only thought that matters about us, then what are we doing wasting, trying to impress other people? Doing all these other things. I remember when I first heard the news and I had to share on Monday night at our church prayer meeting that they had found Andrew's body. And I was so sad because I literally heard as I was just about to, and actually as I was driving on the way on Monday night towards church. It was about halfway to church and it was 5 minutes away. And people were already praying and the music was already playing. I didn't want to interrupt just yet. And we said we would officially start at 7:30. So at 7:30 I got up and I was able to share the sad news. They had found him. And I think in that room, I sensed this thought coming through so many adults at that exact moment. You know what the thought I felt? That could have been my child. That could have been my son, my daughter. And I think that's a right thought to think. But when we think about what's the most important thing we need to think about, what is it? God, what do you think of me? Where do I stand with you? How am I doing, God? Are you happy with me? So we talk about so, and hits this next section. Talks about our desires, and essentially to help us wait for you and live for you. To wait for you and live for you. This set of 4 verses forms a nice little pyramid structure. And the first thing that we get is that we should cry, "Come back, God." So teach us to number our days. I'm sorry. Messed up in my slide. It's the next word. Return, O Lord. How long? Have pity on your servants. That we need to call to God. Come back. One of the saddest things I see is when a child is very insecure and the parent has to go, and you see that child cry because mom or dad is going to leave. And they think that their world is going to end because their parent is leaving, and they cry. And we, of course, look at, oh, they love you so much. But if God were to go away, would we cry like that? Because it would be truly devastating. And so in our hearts we should say, "Come back, God. I need you in my life." And that's the heart of faith. It says, "Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days." That word steadfast, chesed, it's here again. Loving kindness or steadfast love. A love that doesn't end. A love that's durable. A love that's always dependable. And we need to realize your love is what we need for joy in life. It says, "Make us glad as for many days as you have afflicted us, and as for many years as we have seen evil." That even in bad days and hard times, we still need Him. I'm missing a verse here. It's on your text in your page. But the third point is based off of verse 16, which says, "Let your work be shown to your servants and your glorious power to their children." And you know what I see? Is He's saying, I want you to show me what to do by showing us you. To know your heart, to know your plan, to know how you're working in this world, so then I have some guidance, what I can do, where I fit in, what my purpose and meaning are. And finally, let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And it's essentially a statement, but also a prayer, a song, but a request. Saying what? Sovereign God, please bless us. so we know what to do, what will matter, and what will last. You know, in our lives, if we come across somebody passing away, any good person should think about measuring their life. And as a Christian, we believe in an all-powerful God, and we understand that we are so finite, our life is short. And how we should measure it ought to be measured in God's terms, God's units, God's plan, and what He wants. And as we seek Him, as we wrestle with knowing Him, He shows us what really matters in life and what will really last. So, as we measure life, meaning, purpose of what we live for, and how to decide between all these things, our main point, again, is seek God. Seek God. Life can only make sense with His blessings. You know, maybe you're here today and you're grieving for Charles, for Kimberly, for Kelly, maybe even for Andrew. And I want to say they have been unusually, incredibly strong. But we as a church, maybe we're struggling more with that. Because why? Well, I think Charles and Kimberly and Kelly already had a lot of this, as the British would say, sorted. They had it figured out. And they've been working away at it. And they need our prayers, and they need our encouragement and our love. And by the way, folks, please do not go to them and try and ask, so what really happened? They won't be bothered. But your question will tell more about where you are in your faith than in your knowledge. You see, they're working on this. They're seeking God, and they're looking for His blessings. They can look back and see all these wonderful things about Andrew. And yes, one moment is very dark, but a lifetime is full of these blessings. And this lifetime may have not been enough, but the next one for Andrew is absolutely full of blessings. And if we're upset, maybe we can't see God and all of His blessings through all the hardships and all these things. So as the praise team comes, I pray that you would take as we enter now into the time of communion,